Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, airplane enthusiasts, and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. We're glad to have you here. Tonight on episode number 187, we revisit winter of 1944. Our guest is historian and director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, Chris Kolakowski, who joins us to discuss the Battle of the Bulge, one of the World War II's most brutal and decisive clashes. Took place 80 years ago this month. Now, whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're thrilled to have you with us tonight. If you enjoy our content, please spread it across your social media platforms. We do appreciate that. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, our aircraft, local units, or how you can be part of the fun, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight, something might strike your fancy and you think, I'd like to know more about that point that Chris just made. Well, just type that question in the chat box and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. So just type them in and we'll try to get them answered for you. Now, joining us from Madison, Wisconsin, a frequent guest and one we enjoy having with us many times, Chris Kolakowski. Chris, welcome back to Warbird Tube.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's always great to see you, and it's great to see everybody 1 week before Christmas.
Yeah. And in 1944, 80 years ago, 1 week before Christmas was a pretty brutal test for the American forces in the winter of 44.
Yes, the Ardennes Offensive, known popularly as the Battle of the Bulge because of the bulge it creates in the Allied line, is the largest battle in the history of the United States Army. And to my mind, if I was to pick one battle to showcase the American soldier and all that they are capable of in all facets, this battle is a good candidate for it. It's just a tremendous, it really is a tremendous battle.
Yeah.
And it's a crucible for the U.S. Army in World War II. Here's to give it its proper name, the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. I'll use those terms interchangeably. It occurs from the 16th of December 1944 until the 28th of January 1945. And I'll show you where. We'll show you a map and get you oriented here in a minute. Largest battle in the history of the U.S. Army, as we talked about. 33 U.S. divisions have participation credit in this campaign. Now, let me put that in perspective. That's over a third of the total of the 90 U.S. infantry, armored, airborne, U.S. divisions deployed by the U.S. Army during World War II. 2/3 of that 90 number went to Europe and the Mediterranean. The other third ended up serving in the Pacific. So when you put that together, 33 divisions represents half of all the divisions that fought in Europe and the Mediterranean. So for a significant part of the World War II Army, this is a crucible that those units go through. And so that's something that should be mentioned right up front, is the level of involvement by the Army, by units of the Army is significant compared to many other battles for sure.
Right.
But that's a little bit of background about where we are.
And also, even though we're talking about the U.S. Army, there's also an air component that helps set up this entire scenario as well.
That's right. One of the keys to the timing of this, and we'll talk about the German strategy and how the battle starts here in just a second. But one of the things that determines when this is fought and kind of how it's fought is Allied air power. The Germans start planning a counteroffensive against the Americans even as early as September. They start talking about, we need to find an opportunity. It's primarily driven by Adolf Hitler himself as Führer of the Reich and commander of the German armed forces and the German army. But one of the things he says, we have to have a period of bad weather because we have to negate Allied air power. And Allied air supremacy is too great for our armed forces to deal with. We have to take that card out of Allied hands. So even though we're talking about a significant ground battle, from the very beginning, air power has a significant, albeit indirect, effect on the battle and its timing. And then later, it will have a very direct effect, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. So here's where we are. Here's the Western Front. It's December 1944. The invasion of Normandy had been June of 1944. We had the Normandy breakout, the race across France, and then for the last few months before December 16th, there have been battles along the German border. If you look there in the center, kind of center left of the map, you'll see the Ardennes. The Ardennes, it divides neatly the Western Front kind of in half. The northern half you can see is the British 21st Army Group, Canadian 1st Army, British 2nd Army, and then in the center, including the Ardennes sector, is U.S. 12th Army Group, 9th Army, 1st Army, which controls, among other sectors, the Ardennes sector, and then 3rd Army to the south of it. And then at the very bottom in Alsace is the 6th Army Group with the U.S. 7th Army and the French 1st Army. The Ardennes has been, since September, a quiet front. Neither side has really mounted major military operations there. In fact, the United States and to a certain extent the Germans have used it as a rest area, both for units that are heavily damaged in battles in other places and need a place to refit, but also new units that are put on the line and need kind of a light introduction, if you will, to combat against the Germans. The main Allied offensives have been north of the Ardennes, around Aachen and the Roer River area, and also to the south as Patton's 3rd Army has taken Metz, pushed through Lorraine, and is about to enter Germany via the Saarland. The Ardennes itself has been an avenue of attack. The Germans went through there in 1914 as part of the Schlieffen Plan. Of course, most famously, they went through there in 1940 as part of the 1940 campaign that ended up at Dunkirk and the fall of France, which may be a whole presentation in itself sometime. But so it's been an avenue of attack, but it's a very rolling, forested area. For those of you who are familiar with, say, northern Wisconsin, or say the Panhandle of West Virginia, Western Maryland, that area, it's very comparable to that in a lot of ways. You're going to see some photographs of Ardennes terrain going forward, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a feel for it right now. But here's where we are on the eve of the campaign, on the eve of battle. This is the German plan. It's codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, later changed to Herbstnebel, which is autumn fog. And the idea is to punch 3 armies, 7th Army to the south, which is basically a flank protection, and then 2 Panzer armies, 5th and 6th Panzer Army, punch them through the Ardennes, go across, basically you can see where the Germans start on the eastern side of the map, go across the map to the Meuse River in 48 hours, and then as soon as you cross the Meuse, turn north and take Antwerp and Brussels, which are key supply bases for the Allied forces. And the idea at that point is you cut the British off from the American forces and you create all kinds of problems on the Western Front. And hopefully, the most optimistic assessments is perhaps you have another Dunkirk. Notice, however, that this plan requires the tandem advance and the successful tandem advance by both 6th Panzer Army, which is the northernmost force, and 5th Panzer Army in the center. And that's something that I want you to keep in mind, because it's the failure of 6th Panzer Army is going to have a huge impact on the course of the battle. But that is basically the German plan. There are a lot of German officers that are not as optimistic as the Fuhrer that this plan is actually feasible. There's 250,000 men that are going to be involved in this operation. They don't think that's quite enough forces, but it's all that Germany can spare, scraping the bottom of the barrel. But nonetheless, they're going to try it. The Germans are going to try it, for lack of anything better to do. Here's to greatly simplify the chain of command. Here are the spearhead commanders for the 2 spearhead panzer armies we just talked about. The guy on the left, Joseph Dietrich, is 6th Panzer Army, SS officer, one of the early Nazis, had actually been Hitler's chauffeur and bodyguard for a while, and had parlayed that into a series of senior commands, first SS Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Corps, and now 6th Panzer Army. He is known to be very effusive, personally magnetic, aggressive, not staff trained, and as one of his superiors would say, he's effective but stupid. He can be very irrational. That's his quote, not mine. Dietrich has a very professional staff that generally tries to keep him managed and keep him focused. But Dietrich's going to be 6th Panzer Army. In contrast to him, the guy on the right is commanding 5th Panzer Army, Hasso von Manteuffel, is a thoroughgoing professional soldier, and is an outstanding panzer leader, highly experienced on battlefields from Poland all the way through the Ardennes, all the way up to the Battle of Berlin, as a matter of fact, in 1945. He's an outstanding panzer leader, has proven himself at all levels on various battlefields, and taken together, there's no question that the two panzer armies that are going to be the main part of the German attack are going to be led with aggression and skill, and the Americans are going to have their hands full with these two guys and their forces making the main effort, trying to get to Antwerp and Brussels.
One of our viewers, Richard, is wondering, as we're talking about this and the really the break in the weather that gives the Nazis an opportunity, how credible, if at all, is the Allied thinking back to the Supreme Commander of General Eisenhower that the Allies could just sit tight in the winter of 44-45 without major engagement in the Ardennes?
Actually, Steve, let's go to the next slide. The next 2 slides will answer that question, because one of the things that I like to talk about is I like to talk about the Allied mentality. The German attack in the Ardennes is the greatest Allied intelligence failure of the war, except for the failure to foresee Pearl Harbor. And the Allies are complacent. And actually, you'll see this is one of the first of a few slides I use where I do a leader lessons from the Ardennes, and this is one of them that I talk about the perils of groupthink. The Allies have an assumption that the Germans are on the ropes. The German army in the summer of 1944 in the West and in the East suffered somewhere in the neighborhood, if you add it all up, to about 750,000 casualties in all the defeats in both France, in the East, and also actually even some of the defeats in the Mediterranean at the same time. There's this assumption among the Allies that all the Germans can mount are local counterattacks, primarily because that's all the Germans have really been doing in September, October, and November. And so the Allies, as far as they're concerned, the Germans are on the ropes. So the Allies can dictate operations, and they can leave the Ardennes. The Ardennes not anything to worry about, and we'll talk more about that here in just a second. The battle zones in the future are going to be north and south of the Ardennes, around Aachen, around the Saarland, like we already talked about. They know that the Germans are changing the divisions from time to time opposite 8th Corps, which is the corps that oversees the Ardennes sector. So when the Germans send new divisions in late November and early December, the Allies detect them. Oh, they're just units we've seen elsewhere. We've beaten them. They're resting just like we are. That assumption is made. They also suddenly can't find 2 panzer armies. They can't find 5th and 6th Panzer Army. And, oh, they must be refitting. Last we saw, they were refitting near the Rhine River. They must be preparing to be a counterattack force for when we attack into Germany. And we should be ready to meet them then. The Germans actually helped this through deception tactics and also radio silence. Ultra provides some information, but not all, because Ultra is radio-based. And the Germans are now in Germany. They can use land telephones. They've got built-in hard infrastructure that Ultra cannot penetrate. And so the Germans, plus some active deception measures, really do a great job kind of hiding what they're trying to do, and the fact that they're able to mass 250,000 men opposite 8th Corps and opposite the Ardennes. There's one exception to this mentality, and that is Patton's headquarters at 3rd Army, with effects that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then if you could flip to the next slide, I'll just finish this discussion, because this question actually is the perfect segue to this discussion. So here's the Allied mentality on the eve of battle. There's a sense of security. The Germans aren't going to do anything. The 1st Army Chief of Intelligence goes on leave to Paris just before the battle starts. Do you think he's going on leave if the Allies think there's going to be an attack in the Ardennes? Of course, the answer is no. General Omar Bradley, who commands 12th Army Group, which is the army group in the center, 9th, 1st, and 3rd Armies. He's away from his headquarters. He goes away on the 15th of December to go visit the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower. He's away from his headquarters. If he was expecting a German offensive, would he be away from his headquarters? Of course, no. 8th Corps reports all quiet on the 15th of December. This quote actually is from a Wisconsin veteran from one of our oral histories that we have. We felt we were far removed from the actions of the war. And he was in the Ardennes talking about the mentality just before the battle. So this means that when the German artillery fires its preparatory bombardment in the early hours of December 16th, and then the German tanks and infantry start rolling and start pushing west into the Ardennes, it catches the Allies completely off guard. So I hope that answers the question. Like I said, it's the perfect segue into this topic right here. It's the greatest intelligence failure by the Allies except for Pearl Harbor. Yeah. So let's look at the progress of the battle. And let's start up with the 6th Panzer Army attack to the north. I'm going to be showing a lot of maps. I recognize that for some people on the screens, these things are probably Rorschach tests. They're out of the Army official history, which I encourage you to go look at. It's available online. It's fantastic. But the big thing is the red is the Germans, the blue are the Americans. And if you follow that and follow the general lines, you'll get a good feel for what I'm going to be talking about here. 6th Panzer Army attacks. And they basically, this map is the 6th Panzer Army sector with a little bit of 5th Panzer Army at the bottom. But notice how 6th Panzer Army, which is supposed to push across this map in 12 to 18 hours, they get stopped and are stopped for the bulk of the battle. You see the straight line, the straight blue line going north to south and then turning to go west. That is the 2nd and 99th Divisions at Elsenborn Ridge. Thanks for tracing that with your cursor. Those guys stand firm in some incredible defensive battles that are presentations in and of themselves. And stop the 6th Panzer Army from breaking through and hold this and jam the German northern shoulder. So 6th Panzer Army, for 2/3 of its sector, is not able to advance more than just a few miles. And that makes a big difference, because remember what I showed you on the German plan. They're counting on 6th Panzer Army to push through this sector and then turn north and really be the main effort. And so the German main effort gets jammed here on Elsenborn Ridge and around a town called Monschau, and it will stay held for the rest of the battle. And so this, like I said, a whole stand in and of itself. If you read the book Company Commander by MacDonald, he was involved in this battle, and it's just some incredibly tenacious fighting. And the Germans are not able to make a tremendous amount of headway. What it does too is it then forces the main effort to occur further south, and it channels the Germans into a narrower front. We'll talk with effects that we'll talk about as we go. But anyway, that's the first part of the battle. Let's go to the next. A little bit further south, basically this is the continuation of the map I just showed you. The Germans also have a problem here as well. Initially, they have some great success. If you look at the red kind of splotch there, that's the German border fortifications, the west wall. And you'll notice in one place it's covered by a blue line. That's the 106th Infantry Division. They breached the west wall and they're holding that position. The west wall had been breached before, and they have taken over those positions. And the Germans surround 2 regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry. And you can see it's those 2 little bubbles. And they will be surrounded, and after 72 hours of futile breakout attempts, will surrender. 8,000 Americans will go into captivity on December 19th. It's the largest surrender in the European theater and largest surrender of World War II by Americans, except for Bataan and Corregidor in 1942. The Germans, meanwhile, those red arrows, you can see how they push west. They're supposed to get across this map in 12 hours. But notice those blue lines. That's American troops that have rallied around the key road intersection of Saint-Vith and will put up a defense there. And the Germans will first make contact with the defense at Saint-Vith on the 17th and 18th, the U.S. 7th Armored, elements of 9th Armored, what's left of the 106th Division, later joined by elements of the 28th and a few other outfits, will form a defense there. And basically all these units, and this is one of the things that the Army official history talks about, that the Germans never counted on with the American Army, is the Germans never counted on, as the official historian put it, that units that didn't have a pre-battle relationship could work together. And that's something you'll see again and again in this battle, is that when Americans are thrown together, the Americans find a way to get the job done. And Saint-Vith is a great example of that here. And they're going to hold the Germans in this area for a week, from the 16th to the 23rd of December. We'll talk more about this battle as we go. But notice the Germans are supposed to be across this map in 12 hours. Here they are, December 19th. Here they are 3 days into the attack. They're supposed to be over the Meuse. And the battle lines have only moved 5 miles from the German border. So the Germans are meeting very, very determined resistance, even though they initially attacked with a tremendous advantage, particularly in the north. Now in the south, it's a little different story. Let's move next to the next sector to the south, which is the 28th Infantry Division. Oh, before we get there, just to show you a little bit about what it's like. This famous photograph on the left there of Germans attacking towards Saint-Vith, and then you can see tanks of the 7th Armored Division. It starts snowing on the battlefield. It's kind of wet and it's a wet, sloppy weather on the 16th and early 17th, and you can see right there in the photograph there to the left. But then for much of the rest of the battle, there's going to be snow on the ground. It starts snowing on the 17th, and on average, the average temperature during this battle will be 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So that gives you some idea of the weather that they're fighting in. You can see how the Shermans are, the 7th Armored Division, are around Saint-Vith, holding the forests around Saint-Vith, are covered in snow, both for camouflage, but also because it's been snowing. You can get a feel for it, particularly that far Sherman in the photograph there, how the snow has come up above the tracks. And then the infantry patrol down there, photographed as well during this period of the battle. I don't know about you, I can feel that photograph with the cold wind and the blowing snow, and it affects both sides quite a bit. And frostbite casualties will actually be an issue for both sides. So when you're ready, okay, yeah, let's move a little bit further to the south. I got a little bit ahead of myself. This is the 28th Infantry Division sector. From the German border, which is, you can see that red splotch again, is more German border fortifications. From there to Bastogne in the lower right-hand or lower left-hand corner is 12 miles. The 28th Infantry Division was shot up very badly in the Hirchen Forest, and most of the units are absorbing replacements. There are some units that have absorbed two-thirds replacements. In other words, two-thirds people have just joined in the last few weeks and are seeing their first combat. The 28th Division, which is Pennsylvania National Guard, puts up quite a stance. The 112th Infantry to the north is the one that retreats up towards Saint-Vith when it gets cut off from the division. The 109th Regiment to the south retreats southward as the Germans roll through. But the 110th Infantry is overrun. But that's not doing it justice. We'll talk about exactly what happens with the 110th Infantry here in a minute. I did want to point out a couple of towns that you'll see. It's the town of Clerf, or Clairvaux, which is about halfway between Bastogne and the German border. I'll show you a photograph of that. We'll talk about that here in just a second. And then a little bit to the southeast of Bastogne, where you see the blue hatching, is the town of Wiltz. And the stand at both of those places will delay the Germans as well. Notice the Germans are supposed to get to Bastogne in 12 hours. That blue line that you see around Bastogne is American positions on December 19th. The 28th Division knew it had to sacrifice itself to buy time for American reinforcements to arrive. And they bought 72 hours at considerable cost. The 110th Infantry alone, 3,000 men enter this battle. Only 1,000 come out. The rest are killed, wounded, captured, or missing. But they hold on and they buy the time necessary for reinforcements to arrive. It's one of the, as one of the commanders of the 28th said, it was one of the great stands of World War II, and I happen to agree with that assessment. Let's go to the next, if you would. Why do I highlight the 28th Division? Because this is, if you come to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, this actually is one of the displays that we have in our gallery. It's based on the oral history of some Wisconsinites that were replacements into the 28th, and it shows men of the 28th fighting off some of the initial attacks, some of the initial German attacks in the first day or so of the battle. And so I have to pay credit to that. If you want to know more, you can look at our online catalog or come visit us at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison. Okay, let's go to the next. I had to throw the commercial in there, Steve. Here's Clairvaux. This is a tremendous, beautiful town. Sits in a little rolling terrain of northern Luxembourg. It's the regimental headquarters for the 110th Infantry. And if you look at the chateau marked right there on the picture, the regimental headquarters holds out in its own version of the Alamo until the 18th, when the regimental commander says, everybody that can, try and cut your way out and try and return to American lines. The last Americans in Clairvaux hold out in the church in the upper left-hand corner of that image and surrender the morning of December 19th. So that gives you an idea of the tenacity that the Americans are fighting, with the tenacity with which the Americans are fighting all up and down the line. It's the same tenacity you've seen at Elsenborn Ridge, same tenacity you're seeing here at Saint-Vith, same tenacity you're seeing here. Let's go to the next one. Wiltz as well occurs on December 19th, where they put a scratch force together of infantry, artillery, engineers, and basically hold the Germans as long as possible. And they'll hold them out here all day on the 19th of December. One of the reasons this town matters a great deal is it sits on a hill. The Germans are attacking from the far distance, the ridge at the very top of the photograph there. But the other thing is whoever controls Wiltz controls the southeastern approaches to Bastogne. And again, buy time. They're able to buy a full day for the defense of Bastogne to get consolidated. And you may have noticed from the map, and I'll show you a map of Bastogne again here a little bit in a minute, Bastogne is the intersection of 7 roads. In many ways, it is the key road junction for the entire region. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's pull the lens back a little bit here, and let's see where we are. We've been throwing a lot of dates, we've been throwing a lot of things that are going on. Let's see where we are here as the battle's progressing. If you look at this map, and you see the dotted line that runs from the German attack, if you could trace that with the cursor, Steve, that would be wonderful. Thank you. The dotted line right there is where the Germans are on the 18th, 19th December 1944. They are supposed to be across the Meuse by this point, the Meuse being in the far left-hand corner there of the map. They're not there. Most places they're not even halfway there because of American resistance. Now, American reinforcements are beginning to approach the battlefield, and you can get a feel for that with some of the arrows there as well. And I want you to notice, we've already shown you a couple of road junctions. Bastogne, you can hit that with the cursor, Steve, please. Thank you. And then Saint-Vith up to the north, where that big salient is starting to form around the defenders of Saint-Vith. Keep those in mind. We're going to talk about them here and their importance to add to American strategy here in just a second. But before we do that, let's go to the next slide, Steve. I want to put another actor on our stage. This is a forgotten great soldier, Troy Middleton. Outstanding soldier, well respected. There's a reason why he'd been in command in the Ardennes. It's not because he was bad, it's because he was good. Because they knew that if they gave Middleton a mission, they didn't have to worry about it. And so he'd been in command in the Ardennes since September. His job, and he'd been thinking about this even before the battle started, if I get attacked, what am I going to do? His job, as reinforcements are beginning to arrive in the Ardennes, is to figure out where's the best place to deploy these reinforcements. And this is another leader lesson that I use, is he starts to think about, as he develops his strategy, he starts to think about the fundamentals. So let's go to the next slide. Let's look at what he decides to do and kind of what his strategy is. Because in many ways, his strategy helps determine the course of the battle. He looks at the map, he looks at the situation, he's been around the terrain, he knows the Germans face some very significant limitations. First of all is the terrain. We've already talked about the rolling terrain. It limits their ability to maneuver off the roads. Another thing that limits their ability to maneuver off roads is weather. We've looked at the snow, you've looked at the issues. Imagine trying to drive a column of tanks through mud and snow. The Germans are very road bound. That means The fact that the Ardennes has a sparse road network compared to other parts of France and Belgium and Luxembourg. Not to mention the fact that there are not a lot of direct roads going west to the Meuse from the German border. That becomes a factor. Also, the Germans, remember I talked about how the salient shoulders, particularly in the north, but also in the south, the Germans have not broken through everywhere that they needed to. And so instead of having a salient 60 miles wide, the Germans are pushing an salient 40 miles wide. So what does this mean? This means there's only 3 main routes west, 2 of them through Saint-Vith and Bastogne, and the other one in the middle through a town called Uffalise. So towns with road junctions, this means that road junctions are key places. So it's with that in mind, Middleton starts to come up with this strategy. If you can flip to the next slide. We're going to hold the key road junctions. We're going to hold Saint-Vith, we're going to hold Uffalise, we're going to hold Bastogne. Continue to hold the shoulders. Continue to keep that salient compressed and jammed, and don't let them widen that breach in any way. We're going to continue to fight the laying actions on the roads east of Bastogne, in Wiltz, Clairvaux, other places that we talked about. 18th Airborne Corps headquarters and the 82nd Airborne Division are going to go to Saint-Vith and Vilsholm. There's not any available forces for Uffalise for now, but we'll figure that out later. And the 101st Airborne Division will be deployed to Bastogne to hold, along with reinforcements from 9th and 10th Armored Divisions, to hold that crossroads and to have its rendezvous with destiny, to borrow a phrase from the division song. And Middleton, on the morning of the 19th of December, gives this standing order to the acting commander of the 101st Airborne. He says, hold Bastogne. And then Middleton leaves. And I was taught to mention to people, why does he leave? And the answer is he realizes as a Corps commander, as much as he wants to stay and command the defense of Bastogne, he has to keep the broad perspective. And so he withdraws from Bastogne personally so he can keep a bigger focus on the battle as more reinforcements are beginning to arrive. Let's go to the next slide. The 101st, along with reinforcements, are surrounded in Bastogne shortly after Middleton leaves. By the night of the 19th, they are effectively cut off. They are actually cut off on the morning of December 20th. And you can see the perimeter right here, the blue perimeter. Notice in the south and in the southeast how close that perimeter is to the town of Bastogne. It's less than a mile in certain places. So the Germans are very close. And if you see from the red arrows, they launch concentric attacks against the 101st over the next 3 days. The 101st, by the way, when the Germans cut it off, they overran the division medical supplies and the division hospital. So they're improvising. If you've ever seen Band of Brothers, the Bastogne episode, where they're improvising hospitals in the basements of churches and things like that, which is portrayed with incredibly searing vividness, that's very real. That was as close to a docudrama for that type of thing as you can imagine. And the way the people of Bastogne come out to help the Americans as well through this it's something that warms the heart, and still is something that the Belgians remember very fondly, the U.S. Army today. That little finger to the west gets bashed in by December 23rd, and the Germans feel like they have the Americans on the ropes. And so on the afternoon of December 23rd, they send a surrender request to General McAuliffe. Let's go to the next slide. And it arrives at his headquarters. That's General McAuliffe there to the left. The guy to the right is his operations officer, Harry Kennard. Harry Kennard will later command a brigade and later the division of the 1st Cavalry Division, and will be Hal Moore's boss at the Yadrang Valley in 1965. If you know the film We Were Soldiers Once and Young. The surrender demand comes in, and McAuliffe looks at it. Oh, nuts, what is this? What am I going to do with this? And then, kind of puts it aside. And Kennard is in the room with him, and there's a couple other staff officers. They talk for a few minutes, and McAuliffe says, I gotta answer this. They want an answer within an hour or so. I gotta answer this. What am I gonna say? And Kennard's response, well, sir, what you said at the very beginning is perfect. Well, what did I say? You said nuts. And so the famous response goes back to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. And when this is delivered back to the Germans, look, what is this? Is this a positive statement? Is this a negative statement? And the colonel that happens to deliver it says, in a very diplomatic, the diplomatic rendition, there are other more colorful versions out there. Nuts is strictly negative and is translated politely to the Germans as go to the devil. And when George Patton hears about this, he says, a man that eloquent has to be saved. Now, this is not bravado, because McAuliffe by this point knows help is coming. And the reason he knows this is because of what happens on December 19th, the same day that Middleton tells him to hold Bastogne. Let's go to the next slide. On that day, Eisenhower gets the senior leaders from the Western Front together to talk about what to do to meet this German offensive. And you can see it's basically everybody, almost everybody who's anybody, the senior leaders of the Western Front, to get together and figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to meet this challenge. Let's go to the next slide. You can't give a presentation without a photograph of Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton. That's Bradley there to the left. Of course, Eisenhower in the center, and George Patton there to the right. This is actually February of 1945 in Bastogne. That's the main protagonists on the American side at this point in the battle. So let's go to the next slide. Eisenhower sets the table. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. And that focuses the discussion. And for the next 45 minutes, let's go to the next slide. For the next 45 minutes, collectively, these decisions are made. We're going to postpone all the Allied offensives. We're not going to cancel them. We're going to postpone the Allied offensives, fight this battle, hold the line in all these sectors, fight this battle, and then resume our advance into Germany. No Germans are going to get beyond the Meuse. Eisenhower specifies that. And we're also going to counterattack. We're going to counterattack from the south. We're going to try and stop them in the north as well and launch counterattacks as best we can as well. But Patton is going to lead the attack from the south, supervised by General Bradley. And then Eisenhower turns to Patton and says, when do you think you can attack? Patton and his staff, and this is a whole leadership presentation in itself, have been thinking about a contingency battle in the Ardennes. Remember what I told you back about the Allied mentality and the surprise and how everybody didn't think the Germans would attack? Patton and his headquarters were the only ones that looked at the data and said, you know what? There's a chance the Germans might try something, so let's be ready. And so they've actually come up with 3 courses of action, A, B, and C. And there are 3 different axes of attack. Against the base of the salient from Diekirch, Arlon to relieve Bastogne, or from Neuchâtel against the German left flank. They've identified forces to do it. 4th Armored, 26th, 80th Divisions, with another corps, with another 2-3 divisions to follow soon thereafter. They've already thought this through. The plans are in place. All Patton has to do is call and give the code letter, and they'll start moving. And so, having thought all that through, Patton replies to Eisenhower, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. It has been called the supreme moment of George Patton's career. And frankly, as former director of the General George Patton Museum of Leadership, I have to agree with that. Let's go to the next slide. That response energizes the entire room. Eisenhower doesn't believe it, but Patton explains the thought process and explains the plans. Eisenhower says, fine, do it, but I'll give you a little extra time. Go the morning of the 22nd of December, 60 hours. That's still a lot. You have to disengage a field army. You have to disengage about 250,000 men, turn them, move them north, and get them into position over snowy roads, sometimes 100 to 150 miles over the roads, and then go straight into an attack without rest. Only somebody with supreme confidence in his staff and his forces would even propose it, let alone execute it. But George Patton does that, 3rd Army. After the meeting, Patton calls his chief of staff, gives the code letter B, we're going to go against Bastogne, go to Bastogne, and then he goes into the field to supervise the movement, spends the next 2 days among his troops. It's a tremendous success. This is the map that shows the first stage of it, the reserves that start to move north. It's not a tremendously dramatic map, but keep in mind that all of those blue divisions that you see right there, half of them will then follow the move to the north. So it gives you a feel for the magnitude of the task that Patton has set for his army. And Third Army, as scheduled, will get into action on December 22nd. Let's go to the next slide. These are some photographs here of infantry attacking toward Bastogne. You can get a feel for the Ardennes sector there to the left. To the right, I feel the cold in that photograph. You know, attacking through the weather, attacking through the snow. But again, they're going in. They know what the stakes are. They know they have to save the 101st Airborne. And the guy down at the bottom is Creighton Abrams, who will play a key role in this attack and the culmination of this attack. And we'll talk more about him here in a minute. This actually is a photograph of him as a four-star general, later commanding U.S. forces in Vietnam, and ultimately he'll be Chief of Staff of the Army in the 1970s. Let's go to the next slide. One of the advantages that George Patton has is that the weather clears on December 23rd. And so from December 23rd to December 27th, there's actually really good flying weather. And so 8th and 9th Air Force, particularly 9th Air Force, they had been flying basically 100 sorties a day just because that's how bad the weather was. The Air Force official history talks about how they start flying sorties both in support of ground troops, but also air dropping supplies on a level not seen since the Battle for Normandy. And you will sortie at least 600 sorties by the tactical air forces supporting both the troops to the north of on the north side of the Bulge, but also Third Army over these 4 days. And you can see there a photograph of U.S. troops watching a dogfight, because the Luftwaffe is going to take advantage of this weather as well, watching a dogfight over the battlefield. And of course, 101st Airborne, the supplies that are dropped in, they glider in a medical detachment. They glider in troops to assist with the defense, and then of course bombing attacks you can see down there against the German road network, and we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So the weather clears, and that makes a big difference. This is Third Army's attack. 4 days constant attack, and you can see how they start basically at the bottom of the map and push north. And on the day after Christmas, Creighton Abrams leads the task force that penetrates the south end of the Bastogne perimeter and reopens the land communication to Bastogne and relieves the 101st Airborne Division. And that makes a huge difference, because at that point, the German offensive in this area has been blunted. And the Allies have secured Bastogne, and by securing and continuing to hold Bastogne, they dominate the road network that the Germans need if they're going to even hope to get to the Meuse. So while Patton's doing all this, what's going on the North Shoulder? The Germans are sweeping past Saint-Vith, and by the December 21st, 22nd, it becomes clear that the defenders might get cut off, and that's not a good thing. So they withdraw. You can see the blue line there on the east side of the map. And they will withdraw back across, supported by the 82nd Airborne and some other reinforcements coming from further north. And basically, I talked about how they jam the German shoulder. They continue to extend that as the Germans advance west. They continue to block any attempt that the Germans can to go north. And by setting up these blocking positions facing south, they force the Germans to continue to push west in search of a breakthrough, either get to the Meuse or get to a point where they can turn north. But the Americans are always able to stay one step ahead of the Germans. Again, they're channeling the Germans into an ever-narrowing funnel. And that enables, let's go to the next slide, that enables U.S. 7th Corps, which has come down from Aachen with the 3rd Armored, 84th Infantry, and 2nd Armored Divisions to meet the German spearhead. Now, this is a big map. What I showed you in the last slide is the eastern third of the map. And if you see the blue arrows and the blue circles, that's the 2nd Armored and the 84th and the 3rd Armored. 3rd Armored to the kind of the center of the map, 84th immediately to the left, to its west, and then at the very tip, facing the German spearhead, which are those red splotches that you see right there, that's the spearhead. That's the spearhead of the German advance at this point. We're Christmas Eve, and it's 2nd Panzer Division, one of the best, oldest tank divisions in the German army. Notice that blue line in the very western part of the map, that's the Meuse. The spearhead is 5 miles from the Meuse, but they're running low on fuel. And on Christmas Eve, 2nd Armored Division, which has moved 100 miles over frozen roads, goes into action against 2nd Panzer. And in 3 days of extremely fierce fighting, which frankly deserves a book in and of itself, 2nd Armored destroys 2nd Panzer Division and blunts the German spearhead, along with the help of some British that get into the action late because British forces are deploying on the west of the Meuse to block the Germans even if they try to get across the river. This crushes the German spearhead and effectively ends this, plus the fall of Bastogne, or the relief of Bastogne on Christmas, on the day after Christmas, make it clear that the German offensive has no more hope of success. 2nd Armored and the breakthrough of 4th Armored into Bastogne basically doom the German advance. At this point, it becomes an effort to drive the Germans back and eliminate the Bulge completely. Let's go to the next slide. I want to show you some photographs here of what the battle looked like from different sectors. This is American infantry, improvised camouflage. Of course, you don't want to wear the usual green uniforms in snow. Artillery, mechanized artillery at the 3rd Armored Division in action right around Christmas Eve. And then up the upper right-hand corner is tanks of the 6th Armored Division going into action in a snowstorm during the attack north. 3rd Army's attack northward, and then you've got some other American troops of the 101st Airborne in and around Bastogne. But again, it gives you a feel for the weather. It gives you a feel for, this is one of those areas where crossroads and even houses and even shelter at night can be of great tactical advantage and can be scenes of very hard fighting. But the U.S. Army makes it happen. The United States Army Air Force also gets involved starting on December 23rd. And I want to show you this map. This is actually from the Air Force official history. Because one of the things that the Air Force realizes that they can do to contribute in addition to tactical air is try and isolate the battlefield and strangle German communications, particularly rail communications. If you look there on the western side of the map, you'll see Bastogne, you'll see Saint-Vith, right at the very western edge of the map where kind of the roads, there you go, where Steve's circling with his cursor, that's where the battlefield is. If you look at all the town names that are underlined, those are road and rail junctions that 8th and 9th Air Force begin to pound heavily starting December 23rd and will go all the way through the end of the month. They'll also, if you look at some of the circles, those are air bases that they'll start going after starting on Christmas Eve, particularly 8th Air Force. And notice some of the bridges along the Rhine River. The idea is to interrupt German munitions, German fuel, whatever supplies the Germans need to help then weaken German resistance and help the ground forces. Coincidentally, a lot of those American prisoners are being transported in unmarked POW trains through this area when this interdiction campaign starts. And unknowingly, some of the bombers kill American POWs. So it's a tragic aspect to this campaign, but it does have its effect. It does have a definite effect on the battle. And I would argue one of the reasons that 2nd Panzer and some of its other supporting divisions as well have supply issues toward the tip of the Bulge has something to do with what you're seeing right here. And so the Air Force is definitely involved in this fight and supporting the ground forces. And that should be mentioned. Let's go to the next. So the month of January basically turns into a fight back. And by the 28th of January, you can see the dark line there is the 26th of December. That's the high water mark of the German offensive. The Bastogne is relieved on that day. That's also the day 2nd Armored destroys 2nd Panzer at the tip of the Bulge. And then from there, they concentric series of Allied attacks push the Germans back. And by January 28th, the Germans are back where they have started. And the Allies at that point are ready to plunge into Germany. Their offensive into Germany may have been delayed, but it was not prevented. And in that sense, Wacht am Rhein which was supposed to stop the Allies and disrupt Allied operations, has been a failure. It was not cheap. 700,000 Americans fought in this battle, all told, for the entire period. 81,000 losses. I've seen anywhere from 76 to 81. I use the 81 figure for this presentation. The British will engage 50,000, most of them in January, but a few of them in December as well. They'll lose 1,400. The German losses of 400,000 men, they'll lose up to a quarter of that total, anywhere from 20 to 25% of their attacking force, to say nothing of the tanks and the equipment losses, which they cannot replace. And there were approximately 3,000 civilian deaths in the course of the battle from all the different towns that were involved. This was not cheap. This is one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest, single battle of the war for the U.S. Army and in the history of the United States Army. Let me give you a few final thoughts here before we open it for questions. Winston Churchill. It's always good to find, if you find a good Churchill quote, it's always good to include it because I happen to agree with this as well. This was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Absolutely. And then the chief of military history. The mettle of the American soldier was tested in the fires of adversity, and the quality of his response earned for him the right to stand shoulder to shoulder with his forebears of Valley Forge, Fredericksburg, and the Marne. Again, I come back to what I started with, this battle. If you want a battle to showcase the American soldier and what an American soldier is capable of in all facets, attack, defense, improvisation, coordination, think of all the things that we have demonstrated that the American Army proved it could do in this battle, to win this battle, to meet the German offensive and then win. This is an exemplary battle for how Americans fight. And it's something that deserves, it still has lessons for today and deserves our attention, deserves our respect, and deserves our further consideration. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm sure there are. I will be more than happy to answer them, Steve.
Sure.
I'm sure you probably have a few too.
Yes.
I'll throw it back over to you.
All right. And we saw a couple of slides ago the infantry on the ground wearing the white, uniforms. The question from Richard is how adequate was the equipment that was available to the American Army at that time? Colored uniforms we just talked about, footgear, gloves for the cold weather. Was the U.S. resistance primarily rifle platoons or armor or a combination of both? There's kind of two questions there. That's
two questions.
Yeah.
I'll take the first part. American cold weather gear was decent. The problem was there wasn't enough of it. This actually is one of the coldest winters in the first half of the 20th century that this battle's fought in. When troops have cold weather gear, they're okay, but they have to improvise. They have to improvise camouflage, as you saw earlier, with bed sheets, whitewash, things like that. One of the biggest problems is they don't have adequate mittens, and so you get a lot of frostbite, but the big issue is overshoes. They don't have galoshes. There's not a lot of galoshes. If you watch the movie Battlegrounds, which was filmed in 1949 about the Battle of Bastogne, that's a major plot point for a couple of the characters. And so what that means is that the American leather boots, they trap the moisture, and trench foot becomes a very real issue among a lot of these soldiers. And so that's something, we'll talk about frostbite a little bit. I alluded to a little bit of that. Of those 81,000 casualties, if you count non-combat casualties, there's at least another 10 to 15,000 between frostbite, a lot of trench foot, and it's a result of not necessarily having the correct gear. Those leather boots in particular were a real bugbear for a lot of American soldiers, and there are quite a few accounts about that. I won't necessarily get into detail on that. When the American gear was available, it was good. But the trouble was not everybody had it, and those that didn't suffered accordingly. As to the second part, the resistance, we focus on the infantry a lot, but it was infantry. In some cases, it was engineers blowing key bridges at key moments. It was also, particularly in the case of Bastogne, They would create what they called snafu units, where they'd grab the cooks, the clerks, the engineers, all the headquarters people, and put them in the front line as infantry. And then they'd find tanks and support them. So it's a lot of units put together. Take Seaboalt as an example, where you have several infantry regiments supported by several armored units as well. And they all kind of work together and intermix to support each other in the defense. And so that's what it becomes. No two defenses in this battle were alike. It was commanders improvising with what they had on the scene, and a lot of times being able to make it work.
And as we're talking about, you had a picture earlier of the tanks in the snow. How did they perform in that cold weather? Was that a problem, or were they able to cope with the conditions? I mean, aside from obviously the mud, you don't want to get stuck in that, but the snow and the cold, at least.
Actually, the Sherman actually had a bit of an advantage over the Germans. The German treads were wider, and so the ground pressure was heavier, so they would sink. Whereas the narrower Sherman tracks, they could maneuver through the mud and the snow a bit easier. It's a factor. Sounds like a small technical detail, but it was a factor. The Americans are very diligent, by and large, in keeping their vehicles running, or if they turn them off, turning them on every couple of hours. And that's what they had to do to keep them going. But a lot of times, like those Shermans, a lot of those Shermans would idle all night and all day, which also meant that the quartermasters had to be really good to keep them supplied with fuel. But the Americans never really seemed to have that problem. The Germans did, for some of the reasons we've discussed. Plus, they also attacked expecting that they would capture some American fuel depots, and a lot of times they didn't. But fuel maintenance and vehicle maintenance for both sides was an issue. But the Americans, particularly when they're on the attack or when they're on the march, like Third Army, never really had a problem with vehicles, a major problem, because they're in motion, they're attacking, they're moving. It's a fluid, active battlefield. When it's a more passive situation, when you're in defense like Seaboalt, then you have to be more mindful to keep your vehicle running and keep it going and things like that. But there was no question that it was an issue. I mean, there are accounts of guys urinating on their weapons to keep them warm and keep them lubricated. In the heat of battle, or in this case, the cold of battle.
Yeah.
So it was an issue for both sides. But the American equipment tended to be good. The trucks were great. The American equipment tended to handle the cold and the snow very well.
Good. Dave is one of our viewers, and he has a Piper L4 H model, and it was attached to the 30th Infantry Division around Malmedy. Yeah, anything you'd like to add about the 30th?
Actually, this is personal interest of mine, because a family friend who is since deceased was a sergeant in the 30th Division and fought in this battle. And he said he was wounded January 13th, 1945. He said it was the coldest he ever was in that battle. The 30th Division was known as Roosevelt's Shock Troops, and that's what the Germans called them. It's an outstanding division. It's Tennessee and North Carolina National Guard. And they were one of the units that helped hold jam that northern shoulder. And what they did, again, I didn't really have a lot, I only have so much time, and it's a very eventful battle. But if you read about what the 30th did, they really helped stabilize that northern shoulder at a time where, had they not done what they did, it could have broken things loose, and the Germans could have really, really made some significant gains. And so Old Hickory, it's one of the great moments in the Old Hickory Division history, for sure. That's cool that you have that plane, and as provenance to the 30th. That's very cool.
Yeah. In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that this was probably the greatest intelligence failure aside from Pearl Harbor. But once the battle was going, it seems like the intelligence helped keep the American Army in this by being able to know where the Germans were going and to be able to stop their forward movements. What changed? Was it just that people kind of woke up and said, there's something going on here, we better get to work?
That's part of it. But part of it actually is, if you look at a map, it's the road networks. remember the sparse road network through the Ardennes. If you look at a road map of the Ardennes and you try and advance west, there's only so many ways you can go. And the roads coming in, the main road network for the Ardennes actually runs north-south. There's not a lot of east-west, direct east-west at the time, a lot of direct east-west connections. So there's limited routes west. There's a lot of routes north and south that feed into it. And so a lot of it, quite frankly, is astute map reading and realizing that if the Germans are advancing in this direction, I can pick roads A, B, C, and D to block them. So let me start pushing troops down in that direction to help block them.
Yeah.
And that's why jamming the shoulders was so important, is because it took a couple of avenues that the Germans were trying to use to go west. It took it out of their hands and forced them into a very narrow area. Ultra was good for strategic stuff. It provided some tactical intelligence, but a lot of it was what aerial reconnaissance could provide, but also what good map reading and also good communication from outposts and scattered units could, communicating back to higher headquarters. And so it was a combination of all of that that really helped the Americans put it together the way that they did.
Very good. Dominic has a comment and question. He said, what an awesome job, Chris. I could listen to you for hours. Great passion.
Well, thank you for that.
But the question is, how did you get so interested in this piece of history?
I grew up in Virginia, and when you grow up in Virginia, you either are ambivalent to history or you love it. And I grew to love it. I also had the encouragement of my parents, who encouraged my interest in it and encouraged me to pursue it as a career. I started reading about this stuff when I was a teenager. I played the Avalon Hill games with my father, fought the Russian campaign, Battle of the Bulge, fought the Civil War battle, all this stuff, which is a great way to learn the history, is when you play some of those well-done war games. It really gives you a good appreciation for the battle and how it progressed and how it could have progressed. And to be honest, I'm also drawn to compelling stories and the idea of sharing them and the idea of learning from them. And the Battle of the Bulge is one of those very compelling stories. And I appreciate the question, and I appreciate everybody spending some time this evening exploring that story.
Yeah. And Scott's wondering where your museum is located.
We are in downtown Madison, Wisconsin, right on the Capitol Square. We are free, open to the public 6 days a week. You can find our website, wizvetsmuseum.com, WISVETS museum.com. You can also Google Wisconsin Veterans Museum. You can see what we've got. We've also got our collections online, so you can browse through the artifacts we have, some of our oral histories. We've got all that online as well, so feel free to look at that. Again, wizvetsmuseum.com, or just Google Wisconsin Veterans Museum.
Very good, Chris. As always, a pleasure to have you on the show, and we look forward to our next topic. We'll have to come up with something else for next year.
I'm sure we will. I look forward to it already, Steve.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us tonight. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode, or if you have ideas for a future topic you'd like us to explore, feel free to drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. And remember, if you like tonight's show, please share it across your social media platforms. And remember to subscribe and click that bell icon. You'll get notifications of new episodes of Warbird Tube as they're posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds and happy holidays. Have a great night.